Welcome to the podcast States and Migration in Europe. Today we are discussing the question of Ludwig von Mises and immigration restrictions. That's the topics that came in a number of recent debates, quite lively debates. And I am very glad to have to discuss this question Dr. Phil Magnus. So hello, Phil. Thank you for being here. That's very great to have you here and to be able to discuss this question that has been that has led to some misrepresentations on the thought of Ludwig von Mises about immigration restrictions. So Ludwig von Mises is one of the main members of the Austrian School of Economics, one that evolved around the University of Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. And along with Mises, it includes Karl Menger, famous for his theory of value, and Eugène Böhm-Bawerk as well, who work on the question of time preference and who was the advisor of Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises is also famous for his criticism of socialism, for not having a method of economic calculation. But so here we are interested in the criticism of Ludwig von Mises about immigration restrictions. So, Phil, what was the criticism of Ludwig von Mises about immigration restrictions?
Yeah. So recently, there have been several papers that have come out, in particular coming from Quinn Slobodian, who's a historian in the United States, basically charging Ludwig von Mises with being a precursor to all the arguments we see today for restricting immigration, for locking down borders. Although it comes with a caveat because they also recognize in several of Mises's writings that he is in favor of a liberal open immigration policy, especially in the early 20th century. So it's a very weird type of an argument because he never really comes out against immigration itself, but they try to infer that there are building blocks of an anti-immigration argument in some of the things that he's claiming. And one of the points that I make is I go through the history of Mises's work all the way back to the 1910s. So he writes a book after World War I called Nation, State, and Economy, where he addresses the situation in Europe, including barriers, obstacles that have emerged to immigration. And you can follow this theme in his work all the way till the post-war period. So when he's writing Human Action and some of his other responses, once he's gotten over to the United States, because he's a migrant himself. He flees Austria from the Nazis, is stationed in Switzerland for most of World War II, and then moves to the United States and takes up home at New York University, where he basically ends his career. But he's writing about immigration through that entire period, and his argument is the classical liberal case in favor of removing barriers and restrictions to immigration, allowing a free flow of people, just as you'd have a free flow of goods with trade. So he draws that analogy very directly and says that we encourage free trade because it allows for a better allocation of goods, maximizing comparative advantage, all the classical arguments there. And he says that free migration serves a similar function, a similar economic purpose, and should be part of the liberal order.
Yeah, indeed. That was his dominant in Mises' work. This idea that the free movement of labor is a major force for the equalization of wages across countries, and he compares also in Human Action Switzerland, which at the time was not that rich as today, with the United States, and also he was writing at the time of intense trade protectionism and basically saying that, and also migration protectionism in the United States in the 1930s, and basically saying that these were impediments to the equalization of wages, the reduction of international inequalities. So that's the standard liberal arguments in favor of free movement of people. So yeah, I think the detractors of Mises are not disputing that he operates within this broad liberal framework. What they say, as far as I've understood, is that there are some passages in his thought that would demonstrate that deep inside he's actually a racist, and therefore he would make an exception to this overall framework against supposedly inferior races. So, what's your view about that?
We have clear evidence that this is a misrepresentation. And really, what it comes down to is the way that Mises writes. So, he has a very distinctive writing style, especially in his early works, where he likes to lay out the argument that he's attacking, that he's critiquing in full. So, he'll walk through all the anti-immigration arguments step by step by step and display what they are actually saying. And then in the final paragraph, he'll state why he rejects that. So several of these arguments, especially the ones that have come out of Slobodian, is they selectively pick quotes from where he's stating the opponent's argument and present that as they misrepresent it basically as his own view, and then leave out or omit, or in some cases they even edit out the very next paragraph or the very next sentence where he's saying that this view I just described is nonsense and it's wrong. And in fact, we have direct evidence coming from the World War II era that Mises himself is deeply concerned about the racial implications that immigration restrictions have created. And the occasion that brings this up is basically the Nazis. So in 1926, he is traveling across Europe as a university professor, and we have recorded instances from some of his German language papers that he's in Berlin at the University of Berlin and attends a lecture by John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes was actually much more ambiguous on his position on immigration. Like Keynes actually defended some of the U.S. immigration restrictions that were passed in the 1920s. And during this lecture at the University of Berlin, Keynes also starts talking about the problem of overpopulation in Central Europe. Doesn't really say immigration restrictions, but he says that Germany is becoming overpopulated and they may need to take some policies to prevent that from happening. And Mises is sitting in the audience and he says, do you not realize that you're giving a weapon, you're giving an argument to the Nazis to basically restrict immigration from what they view as the lesser races? He says that you're unwittingly helping the opponents of liberalism by making these arguments. So we have this German language essay that he writes in response to Keynes in 1927, and he outright says that this is the wrong way to go. And the same thing happens after World War II when he's writing in reflection on the problems that the world faces, what needs to be addressed, and the problems that are created by World War II. So he writes an entire book on this called Omnipotent Government that comes out in 1944. Is something of a precursor to Human Action in 1949, but explores all the themes of everything that went wrong in the world that caused this catastrophic war to break out. And in it, he has several passages. He says that, yes, racism is now used as a justification for immigration restriction, including racism against people from what we now call the developing world. So he's talking about places like Africa, India, South America, where immigration pressures are starting to emerge. And in the book, he says, I don't have a solution to this, but we do see on the horizon the problem of racism. And he says that this is a problem that we will have to confront and solve in a future generation, because racism is becoming an obstacle itself again in the post-war era to opening up migration, opening up a freer migrant system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Yeah. So as you say, indeed, that he has this habit to first expose the position of people he wants to criticize before then presenting his criticisms, and this indeed may lead to some ill-chosen excerpts from his work that could give the impression of a racial argument. But I was perusing Human Action again, and it seems that first of all, it's present in the sense that he often refers to people who precisely make this kind of arguments about racial. So he is often having debates with those people. So indeed, it's present for this reason. But overall, it's not that present in human action. The
Yeah.
question of immigration, of racism, is not that absent and that present. And as I was perusing, I think I found one passage in which that could be misinterpreted, but in which he was saying something that could lead to misinterpretation, that there is some superiority of some countries over others. But I don't remember now as we speak if he used the word race at that moment, but he refers to the superiority for having developed the mechanisms of a market economy. And
Exactly. Yeah, he's talking about industrialization, and it's a part of human history that certain countries did industrialize earlier and became the wealthier countries. And I do think a lot of his modern day detractors, they read that and they look at the language that was common in the 1940s and 1950s to describe the developed world, and they say, "Aha, that's racist," because it's kind of an antiquated language, even though he's not talking about race at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's I think yes, that's it seems to me a clear position. And in your work, in a recent piece that you have produced, you highlight how precisely Mises was in favor of dismantling some obstacles to the free movement of labor and to the free movement of people, and basically was saying that this need the requirement for that and for the reduction in racism is also a reduction in statism.
Yeah.
That he believes, he has this argument that actually, and that's something very interesting, that it's government intervention which at some point creates, plants the seeds of this form of restrictions through spillover effects of certain restrictions, or by giving in to certain protectionist lobbies. Is it something you have noticed in his work as well, this correlation between statism and immigration restrictions?
This is absolutely the case. He points out that when government steps in and intervenes in the economy, and he says this is true whether it's trade protectionism and tariffs, whether it's immigration barriers, where it's regulatory obstacles and taxes at home. He sees a parallel in all of these different types of policies. As soon as you open the door to the state to come in there and start saying, well, these are the goods that can cross the border, these are the people that can come into the country, you've introduced a political dimension. And that political dimension is then used for either restrictionist purposes, it's used for cronyism, it's used for racist purposes. But he's saying the problem all arises from the same origin. And that origin is that you've allowed the state to step in and start to manipulate basic free movement within the economy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you have any concrete example in his work? I mean, as I said, I was perusing as well, and it seems to me that it remains at the level of generalities that you have just said. But is there anywhere in his work any attempt to create this chain reaction from initial government intervention supposedly to protect some groups, to help some wage earners, to more widespread immigration restrictions? Does at some point, does it try at some point to create the concatenating of the action and reaction until the fully fledged restrictions?
Right. So you get the most theoretical version of that in Nation, State, and Economy, which comes out in 1919, right after World War I. And what he does is he lays out just a succession of arguments that show, like on a theoretical basis, here is the case for free trade, here is the case for free immigration, and says these are parallel to each other. And he develops that in several works in the 1920s. And then the second version of it that you get is when he's diagnosing the problems after World War II. This is Omnipotent Government, is where he starts to write on this, which is at the very tail end of World War II, where he's saying these are the problems on the horizon. And although he doesn't get into like a specific solution, he actually says that the solution is the great challenge for the next generation. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he says the challenge for the next generation is we need to solve this problem of racism is an obstacle to immigration. And he says, I don't know the answer to that because I see all the signs that race-based immigration barriers are still emergent. And he goes through and he critiques and diagnoses these, but he says that they arise from the same origin that you have for other barriers to commerce, other barriers to trade and the economy, and that is the state.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry to insist, Phil, but do you think he has at some point a more elaborated theory of how the state can perpetuate racism?
Absolutely. I think it's implicit there. He does not
Implicit.
like, yeah, it's not like a Gary Becker style, here's the economics of discrimination, but
Yeah.
he does implicitly go through and state that that racial barriers or dislike of certain groups of people are often used as a pretext to enact these policies. So there is this one passage that he describes in Omnipotent Government, where he says that there are people in the developed world today, and he's talking about nations that are predominantly white, and he says that they shudder at the picture of millions of black and yellow people from their own countries entering into the developed world. But in the very next passage, Mises goes through and says that the elaboration of the system of free immigration is actually more consistent with a harmonious coexistence and peaceful economic cooperation because it's done on a voluntary basis if you allow people to move. And he says that this is an interesting problem because it emerges from the state. And then he goes and points out what's happening in World War II. He says that all of these immigration restrictionists that are saying, well, the problems are coming from what was referred to at the time as the third world or countries that are underdeveloped. The problems coming from Africa and South America and places that white Europeans don't want immigration. He says, wait a minute, look at World War II right now. And he says, quote, that the actual menace to our civilization that we're seeing playing out in this war did not come from a conflict between white people and colored races in the other parts of the world. It came from a conflict from people of European ancestry who decided that another group of European ancestry, Jewish people, were a target, were unfit. And that's what happened in Germany. So he's basically saying that all of these people that are complaining about the supposed threat of immigration from non-white people in other parts of the world are hypocrites here. So he's diagnosing it as just this horrible condition that emerges as soon as the state enters in, and he's telling the people that would make those types of arguments about the developing world, look at what you did during World War II. You discriminated internally to Europe and declared that like the white Aryan Nordic races were supposedly superior to other European races, and he's basically saying this is all a bunch of nonsense that emerges from simply opening the door to allowing the state to step in and make these decisions.
Yeah. So I see Razor Mises as a broad scholar of economic liberalism, and he had some incursion in the themes of migration and racism among other things. But my impression of Mises is that he is at a deeper level of understanding of the economy, so he's more of a source of inspiration for those working on migration than someone who would have at some point devoted, for instance, a book or a strong piece to immigration and the kind of migration regime you would see at the global level. But do you think that Mises would have been sympathetic with the slightly more elaborated view that if you have free markets and then you have some equalization of wages among countries, then immigration stops being such a major predicament, and probably as well racism may stop being such a major issue, because racism may itself be a reflection on the misery of others. Anthropologically, it could be that some groups react to the misery of others. They don't want to be contaminated by this misery, and they reject them in bulk, especially when there is a kind of match between their economic level and some phenotypical features. So this concatenation, which is free markets, lead to equalization of wages, which in turn leads to the resorption of racial prejudice. Do you think he would have contemplated something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you framed it perfectly in saying that Mises is laying out the building blocks for a free economy, and those are the implicit extensions. And what we do is we see the work in later Austrians and later economic analysts that are working specifically on immigration. So I point to the work of people like Ben Powell and Alex Nuresta, who have taken inspiration out of the Austrian school, and they continue that logic to the present day. And they do say that, yes, that immigration leads to wage equalization. It alleviates misallocation of resources, just in the same way that free trade does. And what follows from that is greater economic cooperation. And you see that theme over and over again in Mises, even if he's not specifically attributing it to a certain immigration policy. He's saying that one of the great things the market does is a social coordinator. It's a decentralized coordinator of market-based cooperation. And when you have free exchange or free contract or free labor, that tends to be a social force against the discord, against violence and war and all the things that he associates with state action.
Yeah, and on this particular issue of racism, do you think that you would have, again, reading his book, I did not see it expressed directly, but do you think he would have, he could have been sympathetic at least to this view that racism stems to some extent from the inequality among people, economic inequality, and therefore the lack of wage equalization. And so groups that are richer tend to become racist towards groups that are poorer.
Absolutely.
And therefore the treatment is the equalization through market mechanisms. Does it match his possible extension in that field?
Yeah, so this is an area where when economists start studying the problem of discrimination, and this work really gets underway in the 1950s, especially in the U.S. in response to racial segregation. But when economists start to look at that, a lot of it comes out of the University of Chicago. It's Gary Becker and Milton Friedman that are working on this. They start to see the mechanisms of exactly what you described. So I think what Mises has done here is he set the stage for the next generation of other free market economists to look at these issues and spell out those mechanisms. That yes, that racism does emerge from inequalities that are often imposed or enforced by bad policies of the state. It's not inequality in the sense that the left goes after it. The left claims that that capitalism breeds inequality by separating the haves and the have-nots, and you get the whole Marxian strain of economic analysis. Mises is saying something very different is going on here. He says when we see inequalities emerging in society, it's usually because some interest group has gotten the government to put up a barrier to free exchange, and that absence of free exchange allows the accumulation of resources on the preferential side of the barrier, which is usually the interest group that's been able to lobby the government. So using that framework, yes, we have a very clear explanation. If that interest group happens to be racists or segregationists, then they're going to play out in the same way that you'd expect from any other interest group that's putting up a barrier to its own advantage and to the disadvantage of somebody else. And then what you see around us is a real manifestation of that discrimination coming about because of some of the policy decisions that have been made.
Yeah, that's yes, very important and interesting. And maybe a last thought on that. I was thinking about a French historian, Fernand Braudel, who was working on capitalism, and so who was making the argument that capitalism existed already in the early modern Europe, and that he was as a historian always describing the attempts, as you have just said, of groups to distort the markets.
Absolutely.
They were always trying to distort the market, to channel resources in their favor. That's, I mean, then we go broader to a broader reflection. But what would Mises have said about that? How can we solve this?
Yeah, yeah. So Mises, in some ways, is a predecessor of what we now call public choice theory. Again, that emerges a little bit later. It's mostly the 1960s that takes shape, and by that time, Mises is he's 90 years old. He's at the end of his career. But earlier in his work, he laid out a theory of bureaucracy, for example. He also laid out theories of political economy that were deeply influential on Gordon Tullock, who's one of the founders of public choice theory. And all of this comes down to basically interpreting and understanding why interest groups are able to capture the government and distort it in ways that redirect resources to themselves. Mises's overarching point is that liberalism in the classical sense, is a way to essentially bottle up these tendencies that otherwise enter into the government. It says that we need to reject the notion that the government even has a proper role to play in distorting market exchange, because as soon as you open the door to those types of distortions, you get what we now call the public choice problems. You get the interest groups that creep in, and they'll either capture parts of the legislature or the administrative state, and then they start to redirect resources to themselves. So again, it's the importance of Mises is that he's laying out the building blocks that later economists start to develop and figure out the precise applications and mechanisms of. But it all goes back to this point that as soon as you allow the state to enter into economic regulation and intervention, it opens the door to interest groups, and those interest groups are trying to get something for themselves at the expense usually of all of society.
Yeah, and how would he keep the state in check? That's rather the other way around. That's the state that keeps others in check. So how to keep the state in check? That is, how to keep in check an organization that has developed a monopoly on violence on a certain territory and is therefore unbound by definition. How to keep it in check? So there are the traditional checks and balances, but these are internal constitutional arrangements within the state. And as he developed at some point something like that, that is what is he was an economist, not a political scientist, but exactly, what is the framework that can prevent this, as you say, opening the door to state intervention and market distortions?
I mean, basically, this comes down to one of the reasons why he writes Human Action is to make the case against these types of policies, against these types of interventions that are occurring. And Mises himself, and I think more broadly the Austrian economics tradition, they gravitate to something that his colleague and student Friedrich Hayek eventually develops and frames in some of his later works, and that is the concept of a generality norm. A generality norm against preferences at the constitutional level, basically saying that government cannot engage in any behavior that gives out a preferential treatment to one group over another. So it's an abstract theory. It's a theory of constitutional governance, but I think it's very consistent with something that Mises is steering his readers toward, is that we need to have robust international institutions in the sense that they prevent the emergence of a protectionist regime, or they prevent the emergence of an anti-immigration regime. Mises is writing at a time in the 1930s when the international trading system absolutely collapses. It moves from relatively free to very aggressive protectionism overnight in the wake of the Great Depression, and that's all triggered by the Depression itself. The United States locks down its economy with protectionist measures as an attempt to weather the Depression, and then every other country in the world starts to retaliate, and it's a downward spiral. So Mises sees this play out in real time, and he's basically saying that when you have political institutions that reward special interest groups at the local level, this is a way to devolve into just complete chaos in the international arena in ways that are economically destructive, that basically killed off global trade. So he's looking after the war. He says, okay, well, what kind of institutions can we have that prevent this type of a situation from occurring again? And really what it comes down to at the base is just a core recognition that this is not an area that the government should step into. And it needs to be internationally agreed to that like a classical liberal commitment to trade across nations is just the norm that we adhere to.
Yeah, we had an episode in this program, episode 3, with Alain Zissé, precisely on the European Court on Human Rights, and I think it echoes what you say here about the role of international institutions. And the European Court of Human Rights, which was created right after the Second World War, precisely stem from this idea that you can have domestic developments that spill over into the international system. And so by having a system of norms enforced by international courts, you can prevent domestic developments, such domestic developments from taking place. And we had this episode in July when the court precisely intervened in relation to a decision by the British government to try to send migrants to Rwanda for processing. And the court say, wait a minute, this is not possible because they cannot have a fair review of their case. And so this contradicts some basic principles of international law. Right. And so, the discussion we had then was that the court can act to prevent some excessive government intervention in this area, which then spill over into broader restrictions. But yes, so yes, this was an important debate. So Mises is more a broad scholar, placing the building blocks of liberal reflections on the economy. And his position on immigration restrictions is to oppose them in favor of the equalization of wages through the free movement of labor. And he's not far also probably from thinking that racism itself could spill over from excessive state intervention. So once we have said that, we come to the core of what you have been doing in the last month, which is trying to go after the detractors of Ludwig von Mises. So you have been fighting, Phil, with detractors on both sides, if I may, of the political spectrum. And one side is by followers of Hans-Hermann Hope. With Hope, we come back to the question of the state, how to regulates the state. So Hans-Hermann Hope is mostly famous for his book about democracy, the God that failed. And so compare. I mean, for Hope, democracy is a mild version of socialism. And but I was again reading Mises, and Mises is a Democrat. He's not in the Hope's tradition, and those in the tradition of Hans-Hermann Hope say democracy is bound to spill over into excessive state intervention because democracy sacralizes the state so much that the state becomes omnipotent. But it's not what Mises was thinking about. So why? And in parallel to that, the Hopeans, if we can call them like that, took a very restrictive stance on immigration, explicitly this time, and unambiguously. So how can they still consider themselves Misesian?
Right. So this is one of the great questions I struggle with. I mean, the Hoppians are, they present themselves as a strain of Austrian economics, and they call themselves the heirs of Mises, the heirs of Murray Rothbard to some degree. And, if you look on paper, where do they emerge from? Hans-Hermann Hoppe is a scholar in his own right that comes up in some ways under the tutelage of Murray Rothbard, and he claims, therefore, that he's a successor of Mises, who was Rothbard's teacher. So there's like an academic lineage argument that's made here, but the tension is that these theories that he's laying out, and whether the one that you describe about democracy itself versus the Hoppians kind of go in the direction of a quasi-monarchy as the preferential arrangement of government, and I look at that, and this is something that probably would have horrified Mises. He is many things, but he's not a monarchist by any means. He's if he'd call himself something, it would be a classical liberal in the 19th century model, which is all about constraining the centralization of authority, whether that's a monarch or a dictator. So to see that the Hoppians move in that direction of monarchy is itself an oddity. But one of the arguments I make is that Hoppe takes certain things out of the Austrian school. He takes subjective or marginalist theory of value out of the Austrian school, and he does accept that. So the free market implications that come from marginalism are present in Hoppe's work, but he also imports all of these other ideas from non-Austrian traditions and then just kind of relabels them or repackages them as if they're part of Austrian economics. And the two strains that I detect in there, because I walked through his works, including his book, Democracy, the God That Fails, and you find that every time he's talking about Mises on immigration, he speaks about him in the past tense. He basically says, well, Mises had a theory of free immigration, but that was suited for an earlier era in human history. I'm paraphrasing him here, but he says that's an antiquated view from like the 19th century that worked when Mises was writing, but we need a different theory now. So then I asked the question, well, where does he go to get his different theory? And he turns to what we would consider hard right, or in some cases alt-right style theorists. So he has all these citations and quotations from this fellow by the name of J. Philippe Rushton, who was a Canadian eugenics theorist that wrote basically in the 1990s prior to when Hoppe writes this book. And Rushton is about as far from the Austrian school as one could possibly get. He's just this really right-wing, almost race theorist. He's all into pairing up racial categories with IQ and intelligence and concluding basically in a white supremacist direction. He basically says that white people are more intelligent, and you find this in Hoppe's work, all these citations to Rushton in places when he starts talking about issues like race. So what he's doing is he's reaching outside of the Austrian tradition, picking up ultra right-wing theorists and importing them in and trying to blend them in. And then the second area where Hoppe goes for a framework comes from his own background, and it's strange because it's actually on the far left. It's the critical theory school of Jürgen Habermas, who was his dissertation advisor. It's the Frankfurt School of Marxism, basically. And what Hoppe does actually fits in a really interesting critique that Mises makes. So Mises in the 1950s was once asked in a lecture, what are the two threats, or what are the major threats on the world's horizon? And he answers pretty blank, like pretty straightforward in the response. He says, well, it's the resurgence of left-wing and right-wing Hegelianism. Left-wing Hegelian, we know as Marxism, socialism, everything that was derivative from that world. And he's saying this at a time when the Soviet Union is the major left-wing Hegelian power. But it's after World War II when the Nazis have been defeated, so they think the right-wing extensions of Hegelianism have gone by the wayside, but he's afraid of them resurging. So one of the arguments that I make is that Hoppe takes the left-wing Hegelianism of the Frankfurt School. This is conflict theory between groups. Marxists say it's on class lines, the proletariat versus the bourgeois. But he takes that framework and reappropriates it and says instead of classes, it's actually racial groups or nationalities or identity groups that are the conflicting powers. And in Hoppe's work, one of the themes he teases out in the search is that the host country versus the immigrants are the division lines in which conflict occurs, and it's conflict over control of material resources. So it's like this right wing spin on Hegelianism that comes out of the left wing methodology of critical theory, merged in with this far right J. Philippe Rushton style eugenic theory, and you blend those two together, and you basically get this restrictionist argument for immigration that's in Democracy of the God That Failed and some of the other Hoppian arguments that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's so contradictory, it seems to me, because as you say, it sounds more like Marxism than Austrian school. In anything
Exactly.
to say,
There's an article that Hoppe writes in I think it's the late 1980s or early 1990s, and it's basically how do Austrians look at Karl Marx. And the first time I read this, I was shocked because he declares in the opening sentences, he says, Marx's theory of history was essentially right, was essentially correct. He was simply wrong on his theory of value. And if we merge in insights from the Austrian school, we can basically like fix this Marxist theory of history, which is about as far from Mises as one could possibly get. Mises writes an entire book on theories of history in the 1950s, and he's very negative on the Marxist worldview that history progresses through stages that are predictable in scientific ways because of material conflict. Whereas Hoppe essentially accepts that and just says that Marx gets the dividing lines wrong, gets the diagnosis wrong.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know enough Hans-Hermann Hoppe to really have a say in this discussion. But yeah, it seems to me a very special case, and blending different intellectual tradition, as you were saying, and but on the institutions, I saw the point of Hans-Hermann Hoppe, that is that democracy sacralizes the state. The majority voting, when the majority has talked, the state has such a powerful legitimacy that they can act massively. So that's basically the argument. And I think also Mises has some lines on this, that the possible tyranny of the majority over minority. But so how does democracy fit in Mises' general vision?
Well, there's the old joke about democracy that it's the worst system of government except for all the others. So democracy is certainly recognized as an imperfect system in the Misesian framework. But he's also cognizant that you as economists we're trained to ask the question, compared to what? We can't speak in absolutes about democracy. We always have to consider democracy versus other systems of government, and what are the outcomes that they yield. Well, it turns out that democracy, even though it has its problems, it has tyranny of the majority. It's susceptible to interest group capture and rent seeking. These are problems as old as time itself, that every political theorist has written about. Democracy has recognized. But what are the alternatives? If the alternatives are autocracy, if they're a monarchy, if they're a dictatorship, if they're some other different type of arrangement, similar problems emerge. So what we see in Mises is not an absolute statement that democracy is the greatest thing ever. It's not something that we sanctify. It's a recognition that democracy, with some of its problems recognized, is a less bad system than other things that preceded it, other alternative arrangements that we see coming out of the socialist world at the time that he's writing. And again, this is an area where Mises is like a building block theorist to others who work on it. So the public choice tradition takes up the question of what do voting arrangements yield. And their answers to that all say that we need to look at constitutional designs that permit democratic governance, but also protect the rights
Yeah.
of minority
Yeah.
groups.
Yeah.
So you need rights as a core component built into the system to say that government cannot do this. Government
Yeah.
cannot intrude on free speech, cannot intrude on freedom of movement, free economy. These are mechanisms that are put in place to prevent 50% plus one deciding that they don't like the rest of society and attempting to penalize or persecute them.
Yeah, very interesting. Yes, and yeah, I agree with you that the criticism of democracy by the opponents is also problematic, because the kind of spillover that they decry in democracy has recurrently occurred in other types of political system as well, in the in traditional monarchies, or, as you said, in autocracies. So yeah. So a strange case of Hans-Hermann Hope about the affiliation with Mises, which is problematic in many aspects, for democracy, for migration. And there is a second type of criticism, those ones that don't claim at all to be Misesians.
Oh no!
No, they are anti-Misesians, and they. So you have been mostly involved in trying to set the record straight about Mises in relation to the publications of a historian that you cited. And I think your piece is quite convincing. And so, why do you think that Queen Slobodian and others as well have distort Mises? Why do they distort him?
Yeah. So Quinn Slobodian is this historian that comes from a very far left anti-capitalist tradition. I mean, he's associated with the people that would be active in like Occupy Wall Street and some of these protest movements that you see coming out of the very far left. They view capitalism as an imposed system or institution that creates inequalities, serving the haves at the expense of the have-nots. And what they see in Mises is one of the more powerful defenders of free market capitalism. So part of the strategy here, and I've argued that this has become increasingly clear and apparent in Slobodian's work, and why he's drawn to write on Mises and the Austrian school, is he sees them as obstacles to a very far left redistributionist, almost Marxian economic system that he desires for normative reasons to impose. So, in some sense, he attacks Mises for the same reason that in the 1910s and 20s you had people like Rudolf Hilferding that are fighting against the Austrians at the University of Vienna. The Marxists that are coming head to head with the marginalist schools in the early 20th century, they are fighting over the same reasons, conflicting economic visions. But what Slobodian does is he attempts to sidestep actually engaging in Mises's direct arguments, because the socialist calculation debate was pretty much settled by the failure of the Soviet Union. The Marxists, the far left, realized that basically they lost on that margin. So instead, Slobodian's approach is to try to taint Mises's reputation with the legacy of racism, the legacy of discrimination. So it's almost like a slander Mises and discredit him that way. Then you don't have to engage his economic arguments, which is what we see in Slobodian's work. And this is the charge I've made directly against him. I find case after case after case in Slobodian's articles where he manipulates quotes to make Mises sound like he's a defender of racism and colonialism. And I'll quote one of them briefly for you. This is what really alerted me to it. Slobodian writes this article where he asserts that Mises wrote after the end of the First World War that all of the gains of colonialism made it worthwhile, and in the end, quote, all other pages in world history were also written in blood. And the implication is that therefore Mises thinks that it's acceptable to conquer by blood. But if you go to the real passage, the original passage in Mises's book, Mises says, quote, all other pages in world history were also written in blood. And then he continues, but nothing is more stupid than efforts to justify today's imperialism with all of its brutalities by references to the atrocities of generations long since gone. So Mises says the exact opposite of what Slobodian attributes this quote to him to do. And I look at this and I say that there can only be really one reason why Slobodian is quote mining and editing in this direction, and it's to make Mises look like he's a defender of the exact systems that he was attacking.
Yeah, there is something that is striking when reading Mises, in particular the book Planned Chaos. It's that you may have the feeling that some of Mises' writings have been written in the last years.
Yes, exactly.
The political system of the 30s or 40s, when Mises was writing most of his works, is not so different from the political systems the political landscape rather, that we are having today. And so in that sense, Mises is very modern in the sense that he's taking a fight with arguments that are extremely widespread today. Yeah. And so it's not, some people argue with him retrospectively as a result. That is, and they use against him, as you suggest, techniques that you see also used against other types of intellectuals today and that are alive. So the accusation of racism is one of them, and it's very common actually to have that. So yes, so according to you, that's a technique to discredit him and be able to proceed with another political agenda, which this time attack the core of Mises' argument. That is, you take him on something that is not central, but on which he has some reflection, and possibly misinterpreting him. Yes, I think you make a case, misinterpreting him, to attack the core of his arguments. There is also something interesting is that the historian Quinn Slobodian has been famous for a book published in 2018, Globalists. Mm-hmm. But in that book, there is a chapter about a world of races, in which there is no criticism of Mises, interestingly. It's in later works or parallel works to this particular book that the criticism of Mises came in. And this is part of what you have done as well. That is, you came after a review process.
Yes.
And you suggest that initially there was nothing about Mises, attacking Mises as a racist, but it came in the middle of the review process.
That's exactly it.
So why wasn't it there from the beginning, and why did it come in later works or in the middle, sometimes, of works under revision?
Yeah. So Slobodian writes this book, The Globalists, is the one that came in 2018, and I reviewed it. I gave it a fairly negative review, but I also credited it for finding interesting archival work. And as you mentioned, he does have a chapter on race there that is not about Mises. It's about some lesser-known figures in the free market world that did engage in racism, in particular some that defended apartheid in South Africa. But he's definitely not charging Mises with that. These are more obscure members of the free market world, and you can go to any point in history and you can find racists associated with almost any political perspective. So it's nothing there that is particularly groundbreaking. But what he does is, after he published this book, I think he got a hint of the fame that came from the book, and then he starts making similar extensions of his argument in academic articles, and he gets more aggressive. And what we find in these articles starting in 2019 and running up to the present day is he also tries to use that same brush to paint Mises as a racist, and claims he was not making in the original book start to be inserted into these articles starting in 2019. And what I found is he publishes the first of these shortly after the book, and it's the one where he has those quote distortions, including that one that I just read to you. But there are numerous similar ones like it. When he published a draft of this working paper online, I read it and immediately recognized, hey, there are problems here. He's misrepresenting Mises's work. So I wrote up a response paper to it and sent it to the same journal that published this article and said, look, here are some factual errors. He's misrepresenting Mises. Let me present an alternative thesis here that I think is more grounded in evidence. And we can debate this and debate it in the pages of the journals as academics are supposed to do. Well, I get a message back like a week later that's just desk reject of the article. It says that we're not interested in your thesis, and I'm like, well, this is strange because I have I think pretty conclusive evidence that this other article by Slobodian that you're running is not being truthful to the evidence here. So I write the editor back asking them for an elaboration, and they don't give me anything. They don't hear anything at all from them on why they accepted his version of the argument, but found mine objectionable. It was just we're not interested. We don't want to publish this. There's nothing here to the dispute. So as I pursue it further, I also discover that in the process. When Slobodian had sent his article out to the journal, they submitted it to peer reviewers, and one of the referees contacts me after seeing my article and says, I refereed Slobodian's piece and I raised the same criticisms. And I told the journal editor that there are major problems with this article. And the referee said that they actually recommended rejecting Slobodian's article, but the editor of the journal just ignored him. So this is a very strange thing in the peer review process when your own referee says that this is a bad article, it has problems that need to be fixed, or else you need to reject the piece. And then the editor says, well, I'm just going to ignore that and run it anyway. So it turned into a very long, drawn-out process where I actually raised an ethics complaint with the journal and said, not only are you rejecting my response to Slobodian without giving a good reason for it, you also rejected and ignored your own referee during the peer review process. This is completely out of academic norms. And the journal, unfortunately, they did a bunch of hand waving, and they claim they did an internal investigation, and then they just brushed it aside. They said, "Oh well, we're not going to pursue any recourse on this. We stand by the article. It's just differences of interpretation." So I wrote up a piece about this, published it in Economic Journal Watch, that walks through the process of everything that I encountered of simply trying to enforce basic ethical peer review norms at this journal over a piece that was very problematic. And what it ended up being is that the journal and its press and its editors stood behind Slobodian, and then come to discover that in the middle of this entire process, Slobodian is named the new co-editor of the exact same journal. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest here that's played out, and I think this is really illustrated that academia has some major ethical problems at the moment, especially when they are willing to accept behavior and processes that violate peer review because they like the political outcome. They like the political message that Slobodian is saying.
In the story, there is something I did not get, but maybe you cannot disclose it. So if you can't, no worries.
Sure.
How did you find the reviewer?
Yeah, so I wrote up a couple of short blog posts about my experience with this journal and the fact that they were not responding to what were substantive critiques of errors in the piece. And the person that had refereed it read my blog post and saw it. And he reached
Which
out.
blog was it?
So I put it up on aier.org, which is
All right.
our website. And then,
Okay.
so the referee just happened to read it and said, "Wait a minute, I remember that exact same article. I was the referee on it, and I
Okay.
recommended rejection."
All right. Okay. So so anyway, to go back to the big point, it's that so yes, your argument is that in that particular case there are distortions of Mrs. thought on immigration and on races in order to discredit it for another political agenda.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would say also that in that particular case, there may be also some institutional logic that you don't want. We know that journals never want to admit they have been wrong. That's
exactly.
whereas it used to be the case in the past, as you were saying, that journal um, used to publish errors or about the content in their pieces. And so, but this was at the time when there was no peer review. So actually, it did not discredit the journal. Now, with the peer review, if the peer review goes wrong for some reason, then it's all the
Admission of
journal
error.
that is affected and that loses its credibility. So you have an interest in never admitting that you have been wrong. That's
Exactly.
something that's also an outcome of an extensive peer review, because once it's conducted, the journal loses its credibility if it turns out to be incorrect. So independently maybe of the particular political line of an article, you have the institutional logic of the journal that makes it extremely hard to run uh, um, a statement of mistakes in an article that has been published, because then you open you
It's
start
the fault
wondering
of the editor.
what is your peer review worth then.
That's
So
exactly it.
yes, so yeah, so in that case there are possible institutional mechanisms like that. But then as a scholar, you have been very much also involved in the debate about anti-capitalism and the historical
Absolutely.
profession, and so you suggest that in that particular case, it was something that is at the root of the misinterpretation of Mises. That is, there would be a widespread ideology among certain historians, and it's not new. Huh? There has been, um, and this affects the quality of the work, and can have some political implications as well. How do you see? So, why do you think the historical profession characterized by a high degree of skepticism towards capitalism and liberalism?
So this is a problem that's existed in the history profession for almost a century now. If you go back in the early 1950s, Frederick Hayek edited a great little book called Capitalism and the Historians. And it was a selection of papers given at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting that he edited together. So Hayek has a paper in there. W.H. Hutt has a paper. There's a whole series of commentaries on why historians are biased against capitalism. Uh, and what it really comes down to is kind of like this self-reinforcing mechanism. If there's a dominant ideological perspective within the history profession that's skeptical of capitalism, views wealth as a zero-sum game between the haves and the have-nots. Some of this comes from a Marxist infusion of viewing material conflict as the driving mechanism of history, but there's also even pre-Marxist biases against markets that have infused into the discipline. Well, what it means is that when historians see an argument that's coming from an anti-capitalist perspective, they're very credulous and welcoming to that argument. They don't scrutinize the evidence. They don't look at the footnotes. They don't ask questions. They just take it at face value as a given because it confirms something that they already believe about capitalism being a source of problems and inequality and injustice in the world. So what we're dealing with is basically built up decades upon decades, a better part of a century of an ideological bias that's existed in this one discipline. And I think it's gotten worse in recent years. We see this in survey data that the history profession used to lean just left of center. Now it's like 80 or 90% on the left. In the universities, if you ask professors about their political beliefs, almost all historians say that they're on the left, and it's one of the most left-leaning fields in general. So I think what's happened here is as earlier generations of historians have retired, including people that were inclined to question the anti-capitalism perspective in the history profession, as they retire, they're being replaced by people that are in ideological agreement that capitalism is wrong and is something that should be opposed. So the field itself has moved even further to the left, and then you get the self-reinforcing echo chamber of whenever someone says an anti-capitalist argument, they just all nod their heads in agreement because it sounds like it's supposed to be true to them.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's clear. I think I am wondering if it's not more the case in the US even than in some European countries. Depend on the country. There are some countries in which it's like that as well, but it can depend. But I was trying to think about that, and so do you think that, I mean, role of states in funding the profession can play a role in this outcome? I mean, I would say that to some extent I have doubts myself about this possible explanation. I mean, the historical profession has traditionally been dependent on the state to fund itself.
Exactly.
And so you can expect to have a transfer of ideology at the same time as you have a transfer of money. And
that's exactly it.
And
it's what's rewarded. And I've seen these grant processes. I've reviewed documents of other grants that have been given, and I've been a peer reviewer on grants myself in the history profession. And a lot of it comes from the federal government in the United States, and I'm sure it's true of most countries, and I'm sure it's true of the European Union as well. When they fund academic research, there is a bias in the types of grants that get approved. So, like I read a grant application from this other book that was basically like this far left wing conspiracy theory about Milton Friedman and the neoliberals taking over the economy in the 20th century. And you read the comments that came out of the grant review process, and the people that the government had selected, the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States, had selected to review the process, all just basically nodded in agreement as if this is an accepted truth that Milton Friedman had done all these horrible things, and then they rubber stamp it. So the tax money is coming out of the government to reinforce an anti-capitalist narrative, and that anti-capitalist narrative is then used to make the political case on why the government should be more interventionist in the economy. So it's a self-reinforcing relationship between government grants, the academy, and political activism.
Yeah, in the case of the European Union, I have my own thoughts about that also, because the EU itself is, at least until today, a liberal project. It's not like the US.
It's not founded on free trade, essentially.
Yes. It's not like the US federal government or national governments. But I was not thinking primarily about grants, but even about positions, the way universities are funded. But I mean, there is this argument that is the color of the funding body has an impact on those who are funded. But actually, is the left more statist than the right today? There was also this tradition that the right used to be more liberal, but it's almost over.
Exactly.
So why does the lean left, if it's the reason, if it has to do with the funding? Because I mean, as the left and the right are both increasingly statist in their outlooks, if this was the primary factor, then you would not have a left-wing bias necessarily. If it was still the Republican Party, for instance, of the
Oh, exactly.
80s,
Yeah.
then maybe it
So
could.
I do see some of this element. I think what it comes down to is the left has an older entrenchment in these institutions, and what we see of the illiberal parts of the right, the statist parts of the right, these are the nationalist conservatives that want to do trade protectionism and basically reject free markets. What they are saying is, well, this strategy worked for the left to capture all the institutions by using big government. We should just copy it, only instead of using it for left wing purposes, we'll use it for right wing purposes. But because they're later to the game, that means that the other side already has a much deeper entrenchment. Although, as you note, what happened in the Trump administration when some elements of the Trump administration tried to get into the history profession, so they funded all these commissions and things that were going to tell an official version of U.S. history that matched their political ideology. But it was basically using the exact same strategy that the left had already done for decades and saying, well, we'll just do it in the opposite direction. So I think that what we see in the bias is that it comes from a matter of timing. The left has been much more entrenched going back for decades, whereas the right is a newcomer to that game, especially after it's turned in an illiberal direction. And as a newcomer to that game, they're just simply trying to replicate the same strategies. But again, the people that are caught in the middle, that's the classical liberals, because we're hated on both sides. We have people on both sides of us that are against what we believe in. So we're really kind of stuck with no home, especially in the government funding world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a very complete explanation about that. And again, also we need to be careful and try to differentiate what could be real ideological motivations and what are sometimes institutional processes that lead to, for instance, with this journal that we were mentioning. But okay, whatever is the reason, and we may end with this last question is, so we were saying that historians have been traditionally dependent on the state, but actually, do intellectuals need the state? Do historians need the state to do history? Do you think the historical profession, with its scientific norms, could exist in a free market?
Yeah. So what I will point out is that there is a huge thirst for historical knowledge in the public.
Yes.
If you look at the bestseller list on Amazon at any given time, there's always a history book at the top. People are buying it. The market demand is there for history. We also know historical tourism. People plan entire vacations around going to visit the castles of Europe, or going to the Battle of Gettysburg, or going to all these famous historical sites because they want to see it. They're spending money, and they're doing so through market mechanisms. So the thirst for historical knowledge is very high. There are always popular documentaries and TV show on historical themes that people watch all the time. They're some of the highest rated shows on television. Now, the quality is not always the greatest, but there's an interest in doing history. There's historical fiction. There are historical movies. All of that points to there being a market demand for history that's not being serviced by the academy. Because the other thing, if you look at all of these books that are on the bestseller list, they're not traditional academic works. They're works written by historians that are generally operating outside of the academy, or if they're in the academy, they're writing for popular audiences, not in these obscure journals. So what it tells me is that the history profession in academia is separated and walled off and has self-isolated it from the popular base of the consumers and the public. And part of this comes about because it receives government funding and government grants and government institutions that are employing these historians. But it also means that there's a missed opportunity here, because if you look at history majors in colleges, they are one of the areas of the university system that's in the steepest decline over the last decade. So
Mhm.
even though we have all these market signs that history is popular, people are interested in it, they want to study the past, they want to visit historical sites, nobody wants a college degree in history. And I think that becomes a clear sign that they view the type of history being done in the academy is off-putting. It's politically biased, it's obscurantist, it isn't relevant types of history, whereas what they're getting from the market via TV shows, popular books, tourism, visiting historical sites is the type of history that people want to study and learn and read about.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And would you say, I'm sorry to to continue,
No, no,
but
it's okay.
what you say is very interesting. So there is this appetite for travel through time. This is
Absolutely.
Amazon bestsellers, visiting historical sites, museums. I think of the Museum of Versailles, who
Absolutely.
must be making a lot of revenue thanks to tourists. I don't have the number, but do you think there is also a market demand for historical expertise? The most demanded experts to talk about political subjects are often historians, not
Yes.
economists.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
economists have the most ready-made solutions, whereas
Right.
historians have generally no clear-cut solution to propose. But nevertheless, there is often this: the public is also looking for historian expertise uh, when um, when debating about common issues, and this is not so. I mean, academic historians do it, to be honest, in the debate, but probably it could be more. It could be more. There could be more history, like you have history bestsellers on Amazon. You could have more historian advisors.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This was something that the Annales School, when it was created by Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre in France, wanted also to promote the historian advisor. So do you think there is a market for that as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a market that's not being filled right now, in the sense because the academy has in some ways monopolized that version of history. So that the classic example I give, if you look to the Great Depression,
Mhm.
people are always using that as a reference point whenever there's economic turmoil, because it's the most significant one in recent history. That we all look back to. So, what are the problems that caused the Great Depression? How did we get out of the Great Depression? That gives us advice on how to weather current day recessions and economic downturns. Economists have very good answers on that. They've studied it empirically. They understand what caused the market crash in 1929, how that spread across the world, how things like the Smoot-Hawley tariff caused trade protectionism to sweep across the world. And then next thing you know, you're in an international
Mhm.
collapse of exchange and economic disaster. Economists know this well, but historians do not. The historians have a political narrative where they say either Keynesianism or New Deal style spending got us out of the Great Depression, and then when they're asked to advise on what to do today, is, well, just repeat what we did in the 1930s and throw money at it, go into deficit spending. So that there's a disconnect between what economists recognize about these events and what historians believe about the same events, that comes about, I think, largely from the historical profession's political biases. So again, what we get there is the problem is that the wrong group of so-called experts are being deferred to, not because they have the best answers and explanations of the past, but because they seem to be the most vocal and the most prevalent in the academy.
Mhm, mhm. All right. So, Phil, it was a great conversation, starting
Absolutely.
with
Thank you.
Ludwig von Mises, then its misinterpretations that led us into a broader reflection on the historical profession. So, thank you very much, Phil Magnus, for having taking part in this program and for having shared your views and your expertise on this notion. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, Phil.
Absolutely. And thank you again.
Bye.